In this section, we are going to explore trait. In this section, we are going to explore trait theory. Trait theory is the theory of personality that we essentially take a grouping of traits and we can look at those traits and create a type. And that type can tell us what type of individual we are dealing with and what type of behaviors they will. In this section, we are going to explore trait theory. The first theory and the first psychologist we're going to talk about is somebody that I could spend hours discussing and learning about. And I know that this adds points to my nerd level when I can say the words, I have a favorite psychologist or a couple of favorite psychologists. But Carl Jung is by far one of the most intriguing psychologists that I've studied. And the reason for that is because he is a neo-Freudian. He studied under Freud, and once he broke off from Freud, he really sectioned himself away from some of Freud's more sexualized ideas, some of his more controversial ideas, but then really got into this notion of personality and the history of personality. And he was one of the first people to come up with the notion of the archetype. And so if you are a fan of superhero movies, of Marvel comic books, of Batman, of Spider-Man, of any type of graphic novels, of any type of story driven type of novelization, movie, or story, you really have to look and give, about three people a tip of the hat, and Carl Jung is one of them. I would say the other two are Bruce Campbell and Stan Lee. And I'm not a huge fan of this genre, but I'm a huge fan of Jung's work. He was one of the first people to really come up with the idea of introversion versus extroversion. And what he looked at was the difference between somebody who is shy versus someone who's bold. But another way of looking at this is, how do you get your energy? Do you get energized by being around people, or do you get energized by going home at night and spending some time by yourself? That's the major difference. Raymond Cattell was an early psychologist who studied personality and believed that there were two basic categories of traits: source traits and surface traits. Our source traits are the underlying characteristics of a personality, the things that are deep within inside us that we really don't have access to but make up the fundamental things that people see. And those things that people see are the surface traits, the features that make up the visible area of the personality. From this, Cattell came up with one of the most ingenious and pivotal personality assessments, the 16PF, which is a personality test that identifies 16 unique personality factors or source traits that are on kind of a binary scale, that you are either one or the other, and those source traits will lead to how you act in certain situations. And so here we have an example of the results of the 16PF. What you see here are 16 different pairs of terms that are kind of the polar opposite of each other. You have reserved versus outgoing, you have concrete thinking versus abstract thinking, and so on. Each of these is going to be something that you can put on a Likert scale or any type of assessment. This is a 10-point scale here, and you'll find that you will be somewhere stronger on one side or the other. Rarely will you be right in the middle at that 5 or 6 point. And so if you look here, there's 3 different professions that have been assessed, and these are just hypothetical individuals, but you can see that the airline pilot who's listed in green, if we go down to number 8, tough-minded versus sensitive, the airline pilot tested very high for tough-minded, where the creative artist and the writer is a little bit more sensitive, and you might think that's kind of a rational thing. If you look at number 10, practical versus imaginative, again, the airline pilot tests on the practical side, where the 2 more artistic professions test on the imaginative side. And this makes a lot of sense, because if you take some of the greatest writers of all time, they were very imaginative. Creative artists need to be imaginative, but airline pilots need to be somewhat practical. They need to be able to make changes in how they're thinking if something goes wrong. But I don't think many people want to get on a plane with an imaginative pilot who decides that he or she wants to take a new route to Houston that goes through Miami and then through Salt Lake City and then through Toronto, and then we get to our destination of Houston. We want them to be relatively practical by going straight through and doing the things that they're supposed to do as an airline pilot. Again, you see someone who is number 15, undisciplined versus self-controlled. That means a different thing for each of these professions. An airline pilot needs to be self-controlled and not undisciplined to make sure that they show up on time for their flight, that they're not showing up intoxicated, that they are self-controlled in going through all the pre-flight checks. That's not the same for the creative artist or the writer, but these are individuals who tend not to have traditional jobs. They tend to make their money as they create their art or as they write their stories or their books. And so they have to be disciplined and self-controlled in order to simply be able to pay the bills month to month. They may get 1 or 2 paychecks a year, and those may be very large paychecks, but they have to be disciplined so that they just don't go spend it. And so they have to have a good degree of self-control. And so CATTELL also gave us what we call the Big Five. And if you are studying business or econ or management, this is probably one of the biggest psychological notions from Psych 101 that you will see applied over and over in business school. The idea of the Big Five personality traits. Basically, what Cattell did is he took those 16 personality factors and came up with these 5 types: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and made them applicable as a way of pigeonholing individuals. And it's not to say that these are the 5 correct personality types, but it's the 5 big ones that tend to be predictive in the business world or with jobs. And so here we see these spread out between low score and high score. And again, low score does not necessarily mean bad. High score does not mean good. It's just what the indication is. So on introversion versus extroversion, or when the Big Five we just call extroversion, a low score would be introverted, a loner, quiet, reserved, where a high score would be a joiner, talkative, active, affectionate. If we go down to neuroticism, which has a really a different meaning when we get into the later chapters of Psych 101 with abnormal psychology, in the Big Five, we're looking at a low score as being calm and even-tempered, where a high score of neuroticism is worried and temperamental and self-conscious. And so here we see these spread out between low score and high score. And again, low score does not necessarily mean bad. High score does not mean good. It's just what the indication is. So on introversion versus extroversion, or when the Big Five we just call extroversion, a low score would be introverted, a loner, quiet, reserved, where a high score would be a joiner, talkative, active, affectionate. If we go down to neuroticism, which has a really a different meaning when we get into the later chapters of Psych 101 with abnormal psychology, in the Big Five, we're looking at a low score as being calm and even-tempered, where a high score of neuroticism is worried and temperamental and self-conscious. Both of those have benefits in certain professions. If you have an in-house auditor or accountant, I would want them to be slightly neurotic. I would want them to be always looking at the books and making sure that we're not making mistakes. Whereas if I have a customer service manager, I would want them a little bit lower on neuroticism. I'd want them to be a little bit more comfortable and even-tempered.